Okay, and so I was discussing the scholarly work of Dr. Stern. Her work has appeared in many journals, including the Journal of Children and Media, the Journal of Advertising, and the Journal of Health Communication, as well as numerous edited collections. So she has presented her research and offered lectures and workshops regarding children, adolescents, and media at an array of professional, nonprofit, university, and pre-K through 12 meetings and conferences. Please welcome Drs. Moran and Stern.
All right. Thanks, Susie, for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. All of you for coming today. It's lovely to see friendly faces in the audience. We have a bit of an agenda today, what we want to discuss, and we're going to be working through who we are, what framework that we operate from. We have the luxury of knowing each other for a very long time and having a lot of similar overlap in our interests and our philosophy. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll move into what are some of the main concerns that people have with regard to youth and digital media in particular. What are some of the industry initiatives, and even more to today's lecture or today's discussion, what are some of the government initiatives that are taking place with regard to some of these concerns? What can the history of children's media and children's media regulation tell us and offer us as we think about regulation moving forward for digital media? What are the challenges of some of the proposals that are being put forward right now with regard to legislating children's media, digital media? And lastly, what would it take to actually have a healthy media environment for young people? What are all the pieces that need to fall in line such that young people can take advantage of digital media and also be protected from potential harms? And that is our goal today. Sounds good. All right, so we'll start with who we are. Kristin, why don't you start?
Okay, so both Susannah and I have been studying media since the mid-1990s. And what is interesting is when we reflect back to our graduate school preparation, we both served and worked for a research faculty member. And, you know, we were worried about the Rugrats cartoons. And we were worried that like there was bad language being presented. So, you know, in retrospect, some of the concerns that we have may seem almost insignificant now, but it really laid the foundation for how we understand the relationship that children have with their media consumption, and that indeed it does play a role in that socialization process. For me, I became interested in not just the negative effects of children's media, but then also how media can be used to influence children in positive ways. So, you know, I study Sesame Street and the ways in which intentional production can actually improve children's learning. So there's a lot of like positive effects that we can think about in terms of the relationship with children and media. And then personally, I have a whole little like observation experiment happening in my home, like once I had kids. And so I could just observe what they were doing. And my research interest kind of followed a little bit of what was happening in my family room. And so when my daughter was like super into Dora the Explorer, there was a lot of, I don't know, kind of accolades like, oh, multicultural media, this is gonna be great. And I sort of challenged that narrative a bit in some of my work. And so now I've got a college-age student, I've got a teenager, I've got a kid with ADHD who uses media in particular ways, I've got like learning differences, all the things that are happening that make me have more questions about what is happening in the digital environment. So that's how I approach it.
Thank you. You brought me back to a project we worked on together that I thought you were going to mention, which was we actually analyzed sexual content in soap operas, daily soap operas. We spent hours and hours and hours coding soap opera content with a big concern about what does it mean that teenagers are getting home from school and watching soap operas and seeing people engage in sexual activity. What does that mean for their own health behaviors? That's what I thought you were going to talk about. But that really was for me too, the beginning of thinking about how do media representations matter? And that takes us, you know, fast forward to today where we're concerned with a lot more than content. I left Kristin in 1997. I left the University of Washington where we were studying together, and I moved to do my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. And during one of the summers of my PhD program there, I had the opportunity to do an internship at the Center for Media Education, which is no longer existing. But the goal that they had at that point was to lobby Congress on behalf of children and media to make sure that there was regulations and legislation that protected children's best interest. And when I was there, my job one summer, I believe it was the summer of 1998, was to figure out what's going on in this thing called the web. Right. So we're going back. I mean, most people started using the World Wide Web in 1995, but not a lot of young people were using the web in 1995. But there was a cohort I found that summer of young people, girls in particular, who were crafting their own World Wide Web pages by coding HTML to speak to a national audience, or to at least a public audience. And while that seems kind of quaint now because everyone has social media and blogs and so forth, at the time, there was really no place or space for youth to have a forum for public expression. You could decorate your bedroom, you could decorate your locker. Maybe if you were lucky, you could publish in a zine or, your student newspaper, but there was very few places for young people to be producers of media content. And up to that point, all of the media research really focused on youth, children, and teenagers as consumers. And so for me, that really switched. What I started focusing on was not just young people as consumers of media, but also as producers of media. And of course, over the years, like Kristin, my interest developed from focusing on World Wide Web homepages to starting looking at away messages. If anyone remembers what those were, young people might not, blogs, and then of course now social media. So it's been a really interesting evolution of what we've studied, and that's in large part because of the evolution of technology. We're both professors in the Department of Communication Studies now with a focus in media. And today we're going to talk about children's media and focusing a lot on legislation in particular because of some of the things you mentioned. I didn't have the luxury last week to see the talk where it sounds like the ultimate conclusion was that business has to do this. And I don't know if we would agree with that. And so it'll probably be an interesting contrast in what we're going to argue today. But I will also highlight that we are not lawyers. We are not even legal communication scholars, but we do have a kind of a broad understanding of children and youth and media. And so that's really where we're coming from today. All right. Oh, I think I also wanted to talk about our framework for discussion. And so that's just a little bit about us personally, but we also want to tell you where we come from as we think about questions regarding youth and media and what kind of environment is valuable for them. I think the first thing we would highlight for anyone listening who doesn't study children and media is a recognition that children and youth really are a special population. They're not just mini adults, but they actually are different, that they're different in terms of their age, obviously, but also their developmental abilities. And that's why we pay special attention to them. That doesn't mean that they are stupid or that they are in constant need of our protection, but it does mean that we do need to pay special attention to them. And if there are things that we need to pay attention to, because they lack experience or cognitive ability, that we do so. It also means that because of their age, they don't have the same rights as adults. They don't get to vote on what they want or what's good for them. And that's why it's so important for us as adults to pay attention to them, because we don't give them the same opportunities we have to decide things for themselves. I also want to point out, as we talk today, we're going to talk a lot about children and youth and what media mean for them and some of the potential problems that people are trying to figure out. But it's worth noting that most adults have most of the same issues with digital media that children do, in terms of overuse of their phone, too much screen time, a lot of the same things apply to adults. So rest assured that any of the things we talk about today for safeguards for children will probably also be valuable for adults as well. Second main point is that concerns about the role of media and technology on children and young people are not new. You can go back 100 years and people were worried about these crazy thing called movies and what films were going to do in terms of violence. Comic books were going to lead to a whole generation of delinquency. Television certainly got all kinds of attention with regard to letting strangers into your bedroom or your family room. Lyrics, profanity in rap music in the 80s and 90s. I mean, video game violence. The internet, apps, social media, they're not new in terms of the questions that they raise. But there are some amplified concerns that we'll talk about. And then the last thing is really going to start us off for today is that I think, and I will make sure here, I think we're both in agreement that ultimately a commercial media system, such as the one that we have in the United States, tends to operate against the best interests of children. Or at least I would say there is little economic incentive in a commercial media system or to act in the best interests of young people when the alternative is to make more profit. And we do have a commercial media system that wasn't introduced with the internet. Certainly, if you look back at television, it would be a good example of TV is free because the product that is being sold isn't the ads that you see, it's the consumers who are watching. And that is arguably the case today with social media.
I would just add one other point about children and adolescents as a special audience. I want to be careful that we don't assume that just because they're cognitively less developed than people who are older, that they don't have an active voice to play in their relationship with media. And I think often adults will create this automatic assumption that they're passive viewers without thoughtful content or the ability to negotiate, the meaning of different terms. And so we want to make sure that we're constantly aware of the agency they do bring to the media relationship. And I also caution, and I say this to my students as well, is that we have to be careful of nostalgia. Like there wasn't a time before when everything is great, right? We have been worried about things for a very long time. And so I think we just need to be careful of that framework too.
Awesome. Okay. Okay. So what are some of the concerns? You've probably heard people talk about these. These might be concerns that you've raised for yourself. This is not an unlimited list, but you'll see that most people, when they think about what they're worried about with regard to digital media and youth, are the negative effects that they might be having on young people's health and their well-being. So that's everything from becoming addicted to video games or social media, being exposed to inappropriate content, sexual predation, increased anxiety, increased depression, unhealthy social comparisons that might lead to body image issues, sleep disturbances, delayed language acquisition, that's generally for younger kids. We're talking about ADHD, loss of social skills, sedentary behavior leading to obesity, sexting, cyberbullying, stalking. I mean, there's no shortage of things that concern people with regard to youth and digital media. And the reason that they're tied for most people to thinking about digital media is because we do know that there are industry practices that potentially contribute to those problems, specifically data collection that is made possible through internet apps, phones, and so forth. And not only the collection of that data, but the archiving of that data, the tracking of young people, and then using that information to target young people for advertising. Various design choices and formulas that promote indiscriminate and continued usage. So you keep using and you keep playing and you keep going and you keep going. It's hard to turn it off. Design choices, even, things like, like when you watch Netflix, like it automatically goes into the next episode. That's a design choice. It doesn't have to do that. It could stop. So you could pause and think about, should I watch another episode of Inventing Anna or should I go to bed because it's 1 a.m., right? So those are the kinds of things that someone's thinking about and maybe making choices that may or may not be good for young people. Unclear, unmarked commercial content, what we might call advertising, branded content, and then also just making problematic content services too easily accessible. So these are some of the things that people worry about. I think it's worth noticing that these are getting a lot more attention recently in the public eye, but scholars and probably companies have been studying these for decades. These are not new. I mean, we've been studying, sadly, I have for decades at this point. And some research does show that digital media really do play a role in each of these. However, ultimately, most academic research paints a pretty murky picture in terms of how media effects work. We know that media effects research is generally relatively inconclusive in terms of supporting a direct, linear, powerful effect. That doesn't happen. We know that the way people experience media, engage with media, whether they're children or adults, is multifaceted. And so to make very kind of overarching claims about how social media causes girls to have eating disorders or this kind of thing is problematic. And it's certainly not what research actually shows. Determining directionality is really complicated in media research in general, not just now, but it always has been. For example, figuring out if aggressive children play video games because it lets out aggression, or because maybe violent video games cause aggression. There's some research for both, but it's not easy to parse out. Same thing, we were talking about using social media or TikTok or video games for children with ADHD. Some people would argue that the more you're consuming screens, the more you're making children more likely to experience ADHD symptoms. But alternatively, a lot of parents will say, this is a very soothing effect, a valuable coping mechanism for children with ADHD, and so it goes the other direction. Also, when we think about effects like our digital media having these effects, I think it's worth noting that there's no such thing as digital media or social media or online experience, because it's so multifaceted. I mean, think about every time you pick up your phone, you're doing a million different things. So to say that the phone is causing anything is just kind of ludicrous, although we tend to talk in broad strokes when we're talking about youth in particular. The phone, I mean, I'm guilty of this with my own son. The phone is doing this or the phone is doing that. But really what we do on the phone, we could be reading the New York Times, we could be reading Shakespeare, we could be, engaging with our friend across the world, or we could be on TikTok looking at makeup tutorials, right? You could be doing anything. So suffice it to say that media effects and digital media effects are pretty nuanced. And in general, what we do know is that those at greatest risk for these types of negative developments tend to have greatest risk factors for negative health and well-being in offline situations as well. So that's worth noting. It's also worth noting that there's plenty of research, possibly more research, showing that there's a lot of positive benefits of engaging with digital media for young people. Inclusion, finding people who are like you, self-expression, creativity, education, information gathering, community building, like all of these are amazing impacts of digital media, which makes it very hard to just say this is a problem, because it's not a multifaceted, it is a multifaceted situation. Okay, so all that said, I think it is still worth noting that with or without rigorous research, most people have the sense that digital media are causing harm. Does anyone in here, like, just kind of intuitively, when you see kids walking around like this, or you see young people acting in certain ways, kind of you just feel like, oh, that's because of social media? Am I alone in thinking that?
You're not alone.
I'm not alone. I do. I mean, I'm a media scholar, and every time my son does something, I'm like, oh, it's because I let him have a phone. Right. Totally not correct thinking, but we have that feeling. And the recognition that technology companies that are creating these services, these applications, these technologies are aware that their products and services might be causing some harm is really what's starting to concern a lot of people. We all kind of have the sense that it's happening, but recently it became quite clear that not only are companies kind of, doing these and kind of looking the other way, but they're studying it themselves, recognizing there's potential harm and doing it anyway. And that really came to light in last fall when the whistleblower, Frances Haugen, went before Congress, leaked thousands of pages of documents showing that Facebook had conducted its own research and knew that there was potentially some problematic effects of its various products. For example, one leaked study that she revealed was that 13.5% of UK teen girls that they studied, small sample, said that they experienced suicidal thoughts after using Instagram. 17% of teen girls said that they had more eating disorder behaviors and ideas after being on Instagram. And among girls who explained that they felt bad about their bodies, a third said that they felt worse about their bodies after going on Instagram. So a lot of people were very upset, not because we didn't think that maybe social media was contributing for some girls to dissatisfaction with their bodies, but because they knew. We had evidence that they knew, and they did it anyway. And that's really what was significant about all the kind of whistleblower revelations, if you will. So I can sit up here and debate with you, like, should we care that Facebook did that research and found that, because there's actually a lot of research that actually finds very different things than what Facebook found. So I'm not going to debate the merits of the Facebook research. But what I am going to argue is that she got the ball rolling. She's not the first person to say that technology companies were not necessarily doing the best thing for young people, but she was a catalyst for attention. And if you don't believe me, you can look at all the things that happened after she leaked these documents. Wall Street Journal did, a variety of different exposés, but all of a sudden there was all different kinds of reactions. So you see that Snap, YouTube, and TikTok decide, oh, well, we're going to jump into action. We don't want there to be a big backlash, so we're going to volunteer to share our research rather than have it leaked like happened with Facebook. We saw different attorneys general from across the various states in the United States decide that they were going to start investigating what was happening with various social media companies and what effects that they had on the children in their state. We saw that more companies were describing different technologies that they were sampling and experimenting with as a way to promote healthier behavior, give children or their parents more opportunities to protect themselves from experiences or content that they found problematic. Even as recently as a couple of weeks ago in the State of the Union address, for the first time, I think ever in history, the President of the United States acknowledged that media companies have a responsibility for children. And this is like earth-shattering. This has never happened before. And specifically, he said, we must hold social media platforms accountable for the national experiment they're conducting on our children. It is time to strengthen privacy protections, ban targeted advertising to children, and demand that tech companies stop collecting personal data on children. Like, this is huge. Like, if you go back to 2 years ago, the idea that you would ban advertising, which is the main mechanism by which these companies are operating, I mean, you would have been laughed out of the room. Now we have the President of the United States saying it. So unlike ever before in history, I would argue, but certainly for the past few decades, there is momentum that young people are people that we should care about, and that technology companies are not going to do it on their own without a little push from the community, from competitors, maybe to the big companies, and potentially from the government. Before you go on. Yeah, sorry. I'm on a roll here.
That's okay. I was just going to make a point kind of to what Susannah is arguing in terms of an American president making this claim is actually super unique, because when we think about like other countries who have been thinking about media regulation, they came to this conclusion like in the 1990s that we should ban advertising to children. Like the European Union has policies that are much more, some might say socialist, but much more aggressive in their control over media content for kids, where the United States had always been in the position of the marketplace and really having a president that is shifting just a little bit the idea that there might be potential for some regulation in the media sector that would control access to children's consumer behavior or control access to these types of advertising platforms. Like for communications, you can't imagine how huge this is in terms of, back in the 1920s when, radio was being developed and we had a moment of whether or not it was going to be a commercial broadcasting system. And the United States determined that we were going to go down this commercial path. And that's where we've been. And that's what we've been, basically fighting against as parents and as companies, like for a very long time. And so whether or not Biden has the political support to make anything like this happen, again, like the fact that it was stated overtly is really new. Just to emphasize the excitement.
Yes, I think you're right. And you are right. Like the fact, like Biden said a lot of things that are never going to happen or unlikely to happen, I should say, not never, but right. So this isn't a promise, but it is monumental, I would say. And he did say those words. This is a tweet, but he actually said them if you watched the address. Okay, so what do people want? Like, what is the ask, if you will? So there's a variety of nonprofits, Fair Play probably leading the charge right now in terms of what they want. And so just last week, I mean, this is all very current, like putting together this talk for today is kind of fun because literally this is March 22nd. I don't know what's today. March 29th. So this was a week ago, right? So they sent a letter to Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, Kevin McCarthy saying, we demand that in order to protect children and teens' privacy, these are some things that we call on Congress to do. And specifically, we call on Congress to pass legislation. And these are the asks in broad terms. Protect children and teens wherever they are online, not just on child-directed sites. And that's because there was a law back in the late 90s, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which did try to limit some things that companies could do, but it was on sites directed to children ages 13 and under. So you can imagine kids are on all kinds of places that aren't directed towards them. And so they were off the hook based on that legislation. Expand privacy protection to all minors, not just those under 13. Ban surveillance advertising. That's a big one. That the surveillance advertising is the idea that you surveil, you collect data from people, and then you use it to target advertising to them. Prohibit algorithmic discrimination of teens. Establish a duty of care that requires service providers to make the best interest of children a primary design consideration. What that means is that as you're designing new technologies, new platforms, new services, that you design with kids' best interest in mind, not like wait for a harm to happen and then figure out what you're going to do to address it. And this is an approach that the UK has actually gone in with full force as of September 2021, designing an age-appropriate design code. It's all about by design creating things that are good for kids rather than waiting for harms and figuring out what you can do to fix it or fining them for not doing something right. Require platforms to use protective settings by default instead of having to set the highest privacy settings, for example, by default, and provide greater resources for enforcement by the FTC, which is also interesting because the Federal Trade Commission is in charge of commerce and advertising. But a lot of old children's media, which we'll talk about in a minute, the regulation really went through that Federal Communication Commission. So kind of a somewhat, of an interesting choice in terms of who's going to enforce the new legislation. So that's what they want. And lo and behold, there's a lot out there. There's actually 4 bills. There's actually more, but 4 I'm going to talk about in front of Congress right now in various committees for evaluation that are trying to address this situation whereby there is a belief that technology companies are not doing what's best for young people and that legislation can push them in the direction of offering a safer, healthier environment for young people. The 4 I'm going to talk about, and I'm only very briefly going to talk about them because that's like a whole nother lecture about each of these pieces of legislation. But I think it's worth, even at the kind of at the broadest level, to recognize this is pretty crazy that there's 4 bills in front of Congress right now to legislate what people said you should or could never legislate. Right, that this was kind of a hands-off topic, that we don't get involved with the media, that it's a First Amendment right for media companies to offer content that they like, to do as they wish.
And I would say too, and I think a lot of that rhetoric comes from the industry itself, right? So there is a self-perpetuating storyline in the United States that defaults on, consumer choice, and individuals need to make decisions from themselves, and the government shouldn't get involved, and that we should let businesses, do the right thing and trust in self-regulation. And as we see over time, not so much is happening when you have that philosophy. And so again, just the vast amplification of the concern has led to things that we've really never seen before.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The media industry has always said, let parents decide. You'll hear that time and time again. And I bet you will hear that as Congress considers these. I don't have a lot of hope, honestly, for some of these. But nevertheless, what are they? I won't get into too much detail, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the breadth of what's being proposed here. So the Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA, is proposed in the Senate. It will expand protections to kids 16 and under, so upping that age from 13 to 16. You'll see that duty of care that was being requested by Fair Play, creating more safeguards, requiring platforms to perform an annual audit that says, here's what we're doing, here's how potentially risky it is. Are we complying with the rules? Here's how we're complying with the rules. Here's what we're doing to prevent harm to minors. And then lastly, asking, and this isn't exhaustive, but the last thing I'll mention is asking these companies and organizations, to give nonprofits, educators, organizations, the research that they're doing. So for example, all these studies that were leaked, they could have been sharing that information with researchers in the academic community to decide, is there something going on here we should be paying attention to? So now they're going to require it, at least if the COSA passed. The Kids Internet Design and Safety Act, the KIDS Act, not to be confused with the COSA Act. This one is focused more on things like banning features that lead to overuse and compulsive checking. So that's things like I was talking about Netflix's autoplay, nudges. There's an example where it's like, oh, so-and-so is waiting for you. And snap streaks, eliminating public displays of quantified popularity. So when you go on Instagram, you don't see likes. We know that's not good for young people as they weigh their popularity based on how many people like them or follow them. Stopping platforms from recommending content that includes influencer marketing, like unboxing videos would be an example of that. So that's the KIDS Act. Protecting the Information of our Vulnerable Children and Youth Act, which is this is in the House. The Privacy, I think they're trying to make it say Privacy Act there. This one, you'll see a lot of overlap between all these bills. But some of the things to point out is that you'll see a little bit more of that by design orientation, requires sites likely to be accessed by children, so not that are directed towards them, that are likely to be accessed by them, to make the best interest of young people a primary design consideration. So kind of that front end thinking. Establish a new division at the FTC to deal specifically with youth marketing and privacy. Ban harmful uses of children's data, prohibiting all data surveillance advertising, and allowing parents, this is also a new one, allowing parents to sue on behalf of their children if privacy rights were violated, rather than filing a claim as you would with the existing law, like filing a claim, and then the FTC would decide if they should pursue the claim and fine them. Now people can actually sue if this were to pass. And then the last one I'll briefly touch on is actually an extension of a law that already exists. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act I mentioned was passed in 1998. This expands that, but it's proposed by the same senator that proposed it initially. And now it's expanding it to teens. Expands privacy protections to teens, establishes a Bill of Rights for teens that limits personal information. Again, banning surveillance advertising, creating an eraser button so parents and teens can delete information. We actually already have that in California. California is ahead of the game, nationally speaking. And they're also saying, yes, we need someone at the FTC who's specifically focused on that. So that's 4 pieces of legislation at the national level. As I mentioned, California is at the forefront of this. We already have more privacy protections for all people, including children, than any other state. But there is also 2 new pieces of legislation that have just come out in the past several months. The California Age Appropriate Design Bill that really copies that what I was talking about that's in the UK, that's kind of by design orientation that does some of these same things, focused on California children specifically. What's cool about this is it's probably anything that happens in California is probably a little bit more likely to pass than anything at the national level. And because Silicon Valley is in California, sometimes some of the legislature, a lot of industries are in California. What happens here ends up impacting everywhere else. So that is promising, at least for people who are advocating on behalf of some of these bills. And then the last one is the Social Media Platform Duty to Children Act. And this also does something similar, which essentially says that social media platforms can be sued by kids and parents, even for past harms. So it's not like moving forward, if you're harmed by social media, you can use this law. But once this law, if this law were to pass, you could say, I have been harmed, or my kid was harmed 5 years ago, and still sue for that. So a lot happening in the legislative space. So for people who say there's no room or no possibility that the government will get involved, I don't think that's true anymore. I think we see before us that there's actually a lot happening that could make potentially a difference, if not in what actually happens with regard to technology companies, at least in people's awareness of what technology companies could be doing differently. We don't have to accept things the way that they are. So how can the history of children's media and regulation of children's media tell us anything about the likelihood of success for those proposals I just went over? So I'm going to turn to Kristin for a little while, and we'll talk a little bit about history.
and unfortunately, history doesn't give us a lot of optimism on the success of the legislation. So, in 1990, we get the Children's Television Act. It's the first legislation that's regulating broadcast television stations. It requires that individual stations pay attention to their children's audience, that they offer what they call educational or informational programming to children on a regular basis. In 1990, they kind of just hoped that networks and individual stations, affiliates, would honor the children's audience and offer educational programming. Well, no, not so much, because our individual networks became a little sneaky. They started putting children's programming on in the middle of the night and said, oh yeah, what, kids aren't up at 4 a.m.? Like, of course, so they really skirted around the legislation in hopes of not impacting their economic incentives or their profit. So by 1997, we kind of upped the game in the Children's Television Act, put in some, more serious regulations, said, no, it needed to be 3 hours. It had to be on television at a time that children were likely to be awake. They started requiring filing what they called the FCC 398 report. So television, each individual affiliate station, so that's like KGTV, the ABC affiliate in San Diego, would have to file a report documenting how they were serving the needs of children. So there was a lot of attempts to get companies and networks and programmers to fall in line and to serve the children's audience. We saw, again, like a lot of ways of getting around the legislation. A station like an ABC affiliate began taking things from the Disney Channel, like That's So Raven, and calling it educational when they put it on broadcast. So, they kind of get around the legislation because these companies are smart and they have an incentive to do so, because it makes, in their mind, at least, they think that children's television programming is less profitable than other types of programming. And particularly, there's a stereotype against educational programming, because goodness, kids go to school all day. They don't want to be bored by educational television, when in fact, we know good educational TV can be quite compelling. And so the story of Children's Television Act, you kind of get a little bit more restrictive. And then lo and behold, in 2020, they kind of blow it all out of the water again, saying, oh, kids have so many streaming devices, well, just do whatever you want. Stop filing those reports. Like, don't worry about it. We're going to catch you later. And so the children's television environment and the industry worked really hard to kind of keep government at bay. They did the minimum to comply with the letter of the law without really dealing with the spirit of the law, which was to create access to high quality educational programming to a diversity of children, because we know economically there are some families that don't have access to the widespread cable television options that are available. And so the idea was, on free television, part of the responsibility of broadcasters was to offer something for diverse audiences, including children. So, companies are savvy. We also had.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Yeah.
Which I don't think I'm as negative as you on the Children's Television Act.
Okay.
I definitely agree that a lot of stations didn't really fulfill the spirit of the law. But I do think that because they had to do something, it was better than it was before. So there was an increase in educational programming for children. And there was also the impression among TV producers that there was a place and a space for educational programming. And so some good shows came out of that. And I do think some stations did offer more quality programming than they had been, for sure, than in the 80s when we grew up and it was like all She-Ra and
G.I. Joe.
Yes.
I mean, I agree.
Wildcrats.
So it did create a demand for educational programming. So more stuff was produced. And in fact, even today, if you look on Saturday morning on NBC, you're going to see, or Dylan Dreyer going around and looking at little animals and stuff. So you do have more educational programming made available to audiences during that time period. I just don't think it was enough.
Well, that may be true.
Yeah.
I think we're in agreement there, but it wasn't nothing.
That's
all I'm saying.
It
didn't do nothing. It did more than nothing.
Right. And I think that's true for these other examples, right? When we start thinking about the rating system, I mean, the Motion Picture Association of America creates the rating system for films, because remember, back in the 1920s, everyone was worried about movies. So, by the time there may have been some censor, after the motion picture production code, we're trying to get away from censorship that was happening in the movies. Okay, we're not going to have government oversight in film any longer, but we will do these rating systems. So we can let people know the information prior, and then they can make an educated decision about what type of film they're going to watch themselves or take their children to. So the rating system was this promise to families that, hey, we're going to give you a heads up about what type of content you can expect. But again, over time, we don't really have a clear definition of what that means. And we also know it gets, it's part of the marketing tool. So you've got an R-rated movie because we know kids want to see R-rated movies, or we've got a PG-13 that now is like pretty violent that used to be R, but we want to get them into the marble. And so there's a lot of using these information resources that were supposed to be tools for families as marketing tools, and really not very informational for families at the end of the day. And then it just becomes kind of an artificial way for the industry to protect themselves against legislation or against, people complaining like, hey, we told you this was going to be this type of movie. So that's a little sketchy as well.
I again am less negative than you. I think that who knew we were gonna not see eye to eye on everything. I do think that the MPAA has a lot of flaws. And I do agree that it's a self-regulatory system in an effort to preempt regulation of any sort. But I do think that a G-rated movie is generally a G-rated movie. I think it's at the upper bounds that there's more confusion about whether an R movie or a PG-13 movie should have been an R movie or something like that. But I do think it's a helpful guide, and we know that people use it. Parents use the MPAA, whether or not it's really designed for their best interest or more of a marketing is a different related issue. But I do think there's value in these systems. But what's interesting about some of them, at least like television and music, is that they're self-applied, right? So you decide as the producer of the TV show or the music whether you think that it deserves an advisory. And what's different about the ESRB, the video game ratings and software system, and the motion picture is that there is a board which has its own, upsides and downsides, really, as you point out, with regard to regulating from the industry rather than having censorship, which is what the industry would say would happen if the government got involved in any kind of regulation about content. Anything else you want to say, Kappa?
So I guess I want to say something about CAPA. And so that is the online protection. Basically that is passed in an attempt to protect children's data from being collected without them knowing. And it was an effort to, again, let parents know that there is potential data collection that's happening and give permission if they were going to be able to get that information. So any website now that's directed at audiences under 13 have to comply with these legislations and not collect data. What ends up happening, though, is that anyone who creates a website says that it's for 13 and over. So you can really get around the law, because guess what? Instagram, oh yeah, you're supposed to be 13 to be able to get onto Instagram. All of these other websites are made, their target audience is 13 to 16-year-olds, even though we know in real life they are attractive to many age groups. So that's another sneaky thing that
I do agree with that wholeheartedly.
Thank you.
I feel like I kept disagreeing with you. Yeah, so ultimately, if we look at children's media history regulation, we find that there's kind of self-regulation, which is an effort by the industry to say, hey, we don't need any rules or laws. We're going to take care of it ourselves by giving parents the tools to do what's best for their kids. That's kind of one tactic. There's also been a handful of rules. Some of the CTA kind of did a little bit of both, which is either forbidding certain actions, like they put limits on how much advertising you could show during children's programming, or compelled certain content by asking stations to produce children's television, educational television content. And then now with these new proposals, we see kind of an expansion of what's being asked of media companies if we were going to use legislation, this idea of the by design kind of model. So we're kind of getting to the tail end here, where we're more kind of less giving you content and more just kind of debating or thinking about What are the challenges of regulating children's experiences in a digital environment? And what are some of the flaws and challenges with the current proposals? So maybe if you have some initial thoughts about that.
I mean, I think obviously a lot of the challenges that we have is that kids are smart and that in fact, when you make sort of age-based regulations, particularly in a digital environment, it doesn't take a lot of genius to figure out to change your birth date to get on there. And there's really no way to control for that. And then there's also a lack of education on the part of the parents. And this isn't that parents aren't educated in their, profession or whatever they're doing, but like media literacy education in general for the United States population is very low. And so I think that there's a lot of parents who just don't know how to engage in the conversation or what to think about, or they'll make really unrealistic rules that then the kids want to, they just don't, follow. And so I think that there's a lot of unrealistic expectations about what the actual home environment or what kids' lives are like or what parents' lives are like. I don't know. So I think that's something that I worry about.
Yeah. And I think to kind of move beyond what's being proposed here, because these are all what the companies have to do. But I think what you're saying is there has to be some recognition probably by our government, as well as investment in media literacy education, both in schools and outside of schools, parent education. Because a lot of these companies actually do have some really useful tools, but no one knows about them. Or even if they know about them, they don't know how to employ them. And so that's maybe something that has to happen. It's not enough to just legislate, but you actually then have to educate. You might remember, some of you who are in the older group in the crowd, back in 1990, televisions had to be installed with a V chip. You guys remember the V chip? But all television throughout the 90s were created with a V chip, which is a technology that parents could set to block violent content on their televisions, but no one knew how to do it. And so it was there, the technology existed, but there was no accompanying education campaign, or not a very robust one, such that anyone knew it existed, knew that their television had a V chip, and then actually set it such that it could work as desired.
And you can still do that, right? Like there are tools on your television set where you can use the rating system to block. You could block TV 14, you can block, sexual content, all of these different things that again, like nobody uses because it's cumbersome. And then like, what if you block it and then you and your partner are watching TV late at night and then you want to access it? I mean, it just becomes really cumbersome.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as I think about some of the flaws with those proposals that we just set up there, based on what we already know, is that self-regulation is not particularly useful. And so anything that's asking, like you need to design with young people's best interest in mind, that's lovely. I like that idea. And there's, all kinds of standards we could offer, but I think it's a lot to expect a company to do that, like have a good heart, do the right thing. And there's some history, I think, that you've pointed out that would suggest that there's ways to make it look like you had children's best interest in mind when really you designed the product in the service in the way that you wanted to make yourself the most money. I think the age issue is a big one. All these, a lot of them have age like 13 or 16, 18, but age verification is tough. Kids lie, they know how to get around it. But even probably more importantly is that to get young people's age, you actually have to invade their privacy. You have to ask them all kinds of information to figure out and then verify their age, which in itself is an invasion. And so that's really something that's complicated.
And I would also argue that age is just like super random as a moment in time, right? I mean, some 18-year-olds can handle things, some 18-year-olds can't. Some 16-year-olds, there's varying degrees of maturity for all of us, right? I'm not sure I want to give like some adults free reign to the internet, right? And so there's just, age is just a number.
Yeah.
I'm gonna think that more all year long too.
A few other flaws: requiring companies to share research means that you actually have, one of those laws proposals suggested that you have to trust the company will. I mean, right? I mean, Facebook had that research and didn't share it. Just saying you have to share it doesn't mean that they'll share it. Like there has to be a trust relationship. There's no real way to verify that any proprietary research is actually being shared out. It's also really hard to keep up with the industry. It's moving so quickly. And so any laws that we create, like the COPPA in 1998, that was when kids were just using websites, but there was no apps, there was no social media, there were no cell phones. Like, I guess there's the beginning of cell phones, but it wasn't smartphones. And so like legislation gets old really quick when you're talking about a moving target like digital technology. But I also think there's some challenges that proposals will face that make it unlikely, I would say, for most of these, certainly in their current form, to pass, any of them. And that's because there'll be a lot of freedom of speech challenges, I suspect, based on telling companies what they can and cannot do in terms of content. Some of those, we didn't get too much into the details about content, but who decides what's appropriate content or harmful content for kids, right? There's been, examples of companies, for example, limiting access to GLBTQ plus content. Like, who's decided that's inappropriate? That's very appropriate and meaningful to a lot of young people. And so that's, I think, going to face some dilemmas in terms of like, how do you figure out what's appropriate or harmful for kids?
And I think that's something that we've been grappling with for a long time. Like, even the phrase like pro-social content, like at what point, like who defines what's pro-social, what's anti-social, what do we want to teach children? What do we want to keep them away from? I mean, that's, to me, a very dangerous territory when you start thinking about, who has access to what. I mean, I tend to lean on more access, more opportunity, but then people take advantage of that too.
Yeah, it's complicated. And who do we want the government making decisions about appropriate? On the other hand, do we want Mark Zuckerberg making those decisions? Right? It's a tough challenge, I think, to think about content specifically. Compliance and enforcing and overseeing compliance, I think, is another challenge that, as I didn't share with you, but if you look at all these bills, it's really murky how any of this will actually happen. Like, these are kind of great ideas, but to put into action and then enforce them in a meaningful way, I think is going to be a stopping point for most of them.
And even with the Children's Television Act, there were, these companies or these stations were filing reports. And so one of the tasks that my students used to do when we would like check to see if they were in compliance, and then my students would write a letter to the station, saying that they weren't in compliance. But like, that's all we could do, right? Or file a complaint with the FCC that no one's ever going to take up.
Right. Yeah. So compliance is an issue. I think ultimately, if we think about like, what's it going to take? I think it's valuable that all these bills are coming forward, that there's attention, because I think we do need a national conversation addressing the fact that companies have so much power, technology companies have so much power to shape young people, or all of us for that matter. And I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. I think legislation pared down can be valuable. I think parent education is valuable. I think education in schools is really important. So I think there's a lot of places and spaces that we need to tackle this. And also, I think you mentioned this a few times, not to always address everything from a problem angle, like how can we prevent harm? How can we protect kids? But also, how can we take advantage of the best that our digital media environment has to offer for young people? There's so much of value, and it would be a shame if we curtailed those opportunities for young people in our attempts to protect them.
That's a good story.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you. What you can do is just have you field questions
Sure.
and discussion. I guess I maybe misspoke at in the introduction. Dr. Salinas and Garcia last week from the business school were saying that it's really a matter of consumers having to be educated on these platforms and not expecting businesses or companies to actually do anything about their own content or their own, algorithms and how they operate, because if it's creating profit for them, they won't change anything unless consumers demand that change. And so that is why your presentation was so great, because you went through all of that history and all of the legislation that is pending or possibly pending. The thing that it sounds like from a humanities perspective, which is kind of what we're doing in examining technology, is how can we get more people to talk about these things, and in the sense of having more is there a way that social media could actually invite more conversations about what is appropriate? Because I remember the first time I went to Europe, and I could not believe the commercials that I saw just on regular everyday television, like a woman in the shower and completely nude and soaping herself up, and a regular commercial. So it wasn't like on, a pornography station. It was just, it's a society where they accept levels of nudity, levels of sexuality that we in our society in the States don't accept. And so getting to what's appropriate is difficult in terms of just what do we want to say? Because it doesn't seem as though there's a negative effect necessarily of content like that is kind of just in the air, or just the way that they use alcohol or those sorts of things. It just seems different. And here it seems like we feel like, oh my gosh, I remember when my son was little, and there was one parent that wouldn't let her son come over to our house because I let my kid watch SpongeBob. And she said, we don't watch SpongeBob in our house, and I don't want my child exposed possibly to SpongeBob. And so it's like, this is where we're just not talking enough about all of these nuances that I'm just so grateful that you presented.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, the European example. I mean, certainly I'm going to imagine that you were in Europe, not your first time, not just the other day. So
No, this
right.
was a while ago.
Right. And so I think that at that point, we actually had differences in media systems in the 80s and 90s where you really saw, like, especially in Europe, where you had a history of government broadcast stations, and there was a lot more government oversight, and the way in which nudity operates in Europe is certainly at a different level than it does in the United States. And so, but now, like with globalization, or that's not even a term anymore, but like with our interactive media systems, like social media doesn't stop at any national borders. It's not stopping at, the Atlantic Ocean. And so, and the other area that I study and I think is really fascinating was what happens when our media content that's created in the United States travels around the world, or when other media content comes in, and how does culture play into that, and what are expectations? And so again, like as Susannah points out, what happens in California is going to impact the nation, but what happens in Europe also impacts the United States legislation. So when the European Union puts on rules about cookies, now every time you go to a website, you have to accept that you're going to have cookies. And so, we don't live in a world where our nation can make a decision that's separated from the technology spreading across the globe. So I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
I have a few questions. First, I remember talking about that study with the girls, like the teenage girls, and like how they said like 13.5% were like they thought they had eating disorders because of social media. But how do you, I'm sure they think they have it from social media. How can one prove that it's from social, or even you just can't?
You can't. I mean, people can self-report, I feel worse after, and that was a survey. And so a survey is a method of self-report. So they reported, it was a small sample too. I mean, there's a lot of flaws, as I was saying, like the rigor of the research is questionable. So you're right. I don't think we can say unequivocally that it does or it doesn't. I think there is anecdotal evidence that for some girls it does, and for most girls it doesn't. I think that's all we can say, but nothing more than that at this point.
And also another one was when they were saying the best for we want the best for the children. I mean, I'm sure if I was a company lawyer, I'd argue that giving them targeted ads is the best thing that we can appealing to them. So
That you make a good argument. I mean, that is the corporate, way of approaching this, is that is how they've been able to do this, because advertising is a service, right? Of course, kids need to know what's available to them. They have, so that is a logical way of approaching keeping legislation out of your company. So you're headed to law school.
I mean, yeah, I think you probably know the counter arguments to that, right? But that is something that the industry would argue, that there's benefit, right? People need to know what products and services are available. They need to know how much they cost. They need to know their benefits and that kind of thing. But we also know that advertisements are not like other products. It's not like buying a toaster, and the only thing it does is cook your toast, but rather that advertising has effects. It affects the way people think about values, what's important to them, what success is, what love looks like, what beauty is. And so we could say that advertising does more than sell a product or a service. but it sells things that impact everyday life, culture, experience, behavior. And for that reason, we need to think about it differently. It's not the same as any other kind of message or product, if you will. That would be the counter argument, I think. But you're right. I mean, certainly that is an argument that's made. And that's why I would say if you go back 100 years, why we have a commercial media system, because this was thought to be of value to offer information to people. And it also reduced the cost because now they don't have to pay for it.
I had two more questions. Can I just ask them, or does anyone else? Okay. The other one, so like, I remember when you guys were in the beginning, we were talking about like the old stuff, like the PG and all that, or like all the legislation that was trying to be passed, like this isn't a new issue. So like, what makes it like, why would this ever? And if that stuff hasn't really happened, why will it? Or like, or I just don't see like if history repeats itself.
Well, I think that's where we disagreed, because I actually do think that the legislation we have did something. It didn't do everything, but I don't think it did nothing. And so I think the Children's Television Act, for example, there hasn't been, honestly, if you look back across it, there has been very little legislation that's actually passed. I mean, we mentioned what, 3 bills
in like the history of the industry.
Yeah, so there has not been a lot. So it hasn't done nothing, but I think now there is the will in a way that hasn't at least been for the past 30 years. There was a time in the early 80s when there was a lot of concern about television, specifically television. But I think there's a lot of will now to address these companies. And I don't think it's just about young people. I think as a society and as a world, we're realizing that Facebook, for example, or Meta is bigger than many countries in terms of the power they have to affect change. And that's scary. And if we want to do anything about it, a lot of people have gotten quite savvy to realize, if we frame this as an issue about children, we can start getting in some legislation to restrict, for example, surveillance advertising. And then at that point, maybe we'll realize, oh, this actually is something we could do. It's not this verboten thing. And then maybe we could expand it beyond children, or that the children would grow up to not want their rights given away when they become adults. And maybe they'd be more open to legislation that was more widespread. So I don't think the history says that it couldn't work at all. I think it's worth an effort to figure it out. That's my take.
I mean, I would also say, yeah, I mean, I do think that there was movement within the industry to respond to the legislation. There was a lot of movement to try to put the blame on parents and families and say, like, you guys need to figure this out. And if you don't want your kid exposed to this content, just tell them not to get exposed to that content or restrict it in your home. And I think that's starting to shift because generations change. And the people who are parenting now grew up with technology in a way that previous generations hadn't used technology. And I think that the mobile device has amplified these concerns, because it used to be, honestly, that there was a moment in the day when your children weren't exposed to media. But now, like, there is rarely a moment in the day that you don't have your phone with you. And so I think that the urgency is a little bit more amplified. And also, the people who are in Congress have different experiences with technology than they did maybe 30 years ago.
I was thinking about the particular historical moment that we're in and the sociocultural context we're in. So I just wonder if you've thought about the role that the pandemic has played in amplifying this notion that this is a problem, right? And trying to think, I know this is not like the direction that you're thinking when you're talking about this, but thinking about what the problems are that lead families to, like during the pandemic, where you have kids that are just on screens all day because both of their parents are working, and what else are you
Well, and that's where their school was. I mean, that they had no other option.
And so it's I think, trying to think to the larger societal problems that exposed, right? Where this is not just, of course, I do think it's a problem with these companies and with capitalism and with what's driving social media, but also the inequities within our society that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic pulled the curtain on a lot of things, right? And I think parents saw what their kids were doing a lot more because they were all forced to be together. I also think the inequities in terms of access, when we saw the need for, you know, what I would argue like free broadband, Wi-Fi, digital access as a public good, not as a commercial entity. Like that's something that we probably need to fight for. We need to have access to the, you know, Wi-Fi, right? Or to broadband in rural areas in America. I mean, there were people just because of where they lived couldn't do what they needed to do. And so that I think is a partner, because that we do know there's benefits. And we know that especially education that was delivered remotely, certainly, I mean, we're teachers, we want to be in the classroom with our students, but it's not horrible. If you have, it's, you know, it's better than nothing, right? And so I do think that the pandemic gave parents a little insight and also exposed where we need to maybe take this technology and ironically make it more accessible. Yeah.
One more thing.
Yeah.
I remember when you guys were talking about like spreading the information, that's like the best way to do it. And I think that's true. And like, if you want like, so you have to think about socioeconomic status. So like say a single mother working like 2 jobs, like she comes home and she's like so tired, she doesn't want to deal with her kid. She wants the kid to like watch something on the phone or like go on social media. She might be in favor of social media companies like policy and like vote for people that like
Help her, yeah.
help that instead, even though and she doesn't know that it's hurting her kid in the long run, because like she just doesn't know because she's working 2 jobs, she doesn't give a shit, you know. So like, so I think it really depends, and like then you think about who should be changing it or who should be in charge, like the governments or the social media platforms, which in the long run are both just different institutions, and then like it's just really weird to think that like I don't know, like yeah, that's kind of weird.
Well, and I think class is an issue that particularly in children and media affects research. We haven't investigated probably enough as a nuance, because a lot of the literature, especially in the early days, was very white, very middle class, very, you know, heteronormative, and all of the kind of family structure of the traditional American family. And so, you know, there's a lot of evidence to show, particularly at the lower socioeconomic status level, that using social media is like not your like your worst choice, right? There's a lot of other things that you could be doing that's more harmful. And so again, like what we kind of want to emphasize is that this is so complex and there's so many different elements about whether or not this is good or bad or how we should regulate, considering all the different ways people come to the interactions with media. It's just murky. It's always, and that's not a hot headline. And that's why, like the Facebook, like blaming Meta, blaming Facebook, or, you know, all, it's so easy. We wish that could just be the solution. Oh, let's just regulate this and it'll be fine. But it's way more complicated than that. And that's where like children and media as a area of study is evolving constantly. Susannah had a comment.
Yeah, all I was going to say to your question, you said, you know, there's some mom who doesn't care what her kid's doing social media. Hope he's not listening. I think they do. I think every mom in America cares whether they're working or not, but they don't necessarily have the opportunity to be there for them. And I think that's why a lot of them would support the requirement that companies do better. And I think, and actually there's surveys that show that parents support technology companies having greater restrictions on advertising to children, for example. So imagine if you are working 2 jobs and you know your kid's going to be home on the phone, you'd much rather that there were safeguards on that phone such that they couldn't have unlimited access to things that are problematic, that they wouldn't be nudged to get on media after a certain time, that they'd be alerted to things that were helpful for them versus hurtful to them. So I think most parents would actually appreciate those kinds of things. Yeah.
And this is the other thing we talk about a lot, and sorry, Barb, we'll get to your question, but this notion that like companies saying parents should just do X, Y, Z. There are multiple people working in organizations with millions of dollars of budgets working against parents. And so we can't just, it's not a fair fight, families against these corporations. And so that's where I think we both agree that legislation could be helpful.
Brad.
Speaking
Dr.
of,
Bond.
So I have more hope in current legislation than I ever have, but it's still quite low. But given changes in the landscape and who the lobbyists are in these situations, I have more hope than I convince these companies of self-regulation is to make arguments that doing so would be more profitable.
Mhm.
Yes.
But I don't know how to do that.
Right. And that's kind of the
Have
green,
you figured
you
that
know-
out? That's my question. It's like, how do we convince them that these types of regulatory behaviors, self-regulatory, like every other industry, media industry, are actually better for your bottom line? In my opinion, that's the only way.
yeah, I don't know.
How do
I don't know that you convince them of that. I think you can convince them that it won't hurt them. I don't know that you can convince them that it's going to make them more money. And actually there is evidence, like if you look at the UK, at least initially, that it's not hurting them. But does that mean it's like you're going to be better off? I guess you could make the argument that you're going to generate goodwill and loyalty. But this is really a challenge to capitalism, that getting bigger, earning more is the end all and be all. And that maybe in people in children's media, Dr. Bond is a children's media professor, so he knows this, but have been fighting for a long time that what's good for capitalism may not be good for kids. Like we can't necessarily hold those in equilibrium, and that we have to decide as a society.
Yeah.
And we have historically decided capitalism and then justified through parent control, First Amendment, all these things. And this may be an instance where, at some point people realize that you're going to make a little less money because you're going to do right by your kids. And I think at the individual level, a lot of people will be on board with that. Even at these companies, I think at the individual level, like an individual person would agree. I mean, most of these, you've probably seen all the headlines. Most people who work at these companies don't let their kids do half the stuff that they're creating, right? They know it's a problem, but it's hard for any individual to have the power to affect the change at the level of a company that has stockholders and so forth, with the exceptions of certain people, like Mark Zuckerberg, who does have immense power, but most people don't. That's what I would say.
Okay, just about out of time. Does anyone want the last question or the last word?
All right.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thanks for coming.